So 2022 is just around the corner, and I decided to make a quick video to talk about possible programming languages that you might want to learn in 2022. And so one of the things I wanted to start off talking about was there was this book that came out in 2015 called The Pragmatic Programmer. And one of the things that it suggests in the book is that software engineers, programmers, whatever you call yourself, should try to learn a new programming language every year. So every year you should try to learn, or at least become familiar with a new programming language every year. And I think that's a good idea just in general. But I decided to come up with a list of 10 possible programming languages that you might be interested in learning in 2022. So, number 10, shell scripting. Now, I know what you're saying is shell scripting. It's like, well, that's kind of basic and stuff like that. Well, depending on what platform you're on, whether you're doing Windows, Linux, or development on Mac OS, those languages are going to be different. And one of the things that started to become increasingly more important in the last couple of years has been that now that people are developing applications for the cloud, shell scripting has become increasingly more important because in order to make applications redeployable over and over again, if you want to use a lot of different CI/CD type of techniques, DevOps and stuff, shell scripting is becoming a lot more important. Those come in a couple different flavors. And so if you're working on the Linux, Mac OS world, Unix world, shell scripting is typically, it's going to be bash shell scripting or ZSH. And those are languages that you typically use for doing shell scripting in that ecosystem. But in Windows, they have PowerShell. And PowerShell is actually pretty powerful as well. And Microsoft has a whole set of tools and stuff around PowerShell. There's a whole community around that as well. And so if you're deploying to Windows-based servers or Windows-based machines, PowerShell is something you might also be interested in taking a look at. Number 9. Now this one might be considered a little bit of a red herring by some people, but I decided to pick Julia for my number 9 language. And Julia is interesting because I think it's a very approachable language, very similar to trying to learn JavaScript or Python, but as well as being dynamically typed like those languages, it's actually compiled and it's actually very quick. You can actually deploy Julia applications into a microservice environment. It's also being used now for data science and data visualization as well. And so Julia in itself has become a very powerful language. It's a newer language, but it's something that especially if you're you have interest in those areas of computer science, it's something that's worth, I think, taking a look at. Number 8, C++ or C. So I really like to think of these two languages as being two separate languages because they are. C++ is really just a set of new language features and stuff that were built on top of C. So the original C programming language really hasn't changed that much since the early 1970s. And C is incredibly important because on top of a ton of code already being written in C, it's the basis for doing a lot of different types of lower level programming or systems programming. So for instance, if you're going to be writing code for the Linux kernel, that's going to be done in C. That's still primarily done in C. C++ essentially adds types and object-oriented programming to the C programming language. And there's been a couple other variants of C that have also done this, but C++ is probably the most popular. And there's a ton of code out there that's also written in C++. The nice thing about C++ is that there's a new version of C++ coming out every couple of years. I believe there's a 2020 version. I think they're working on an even newer version now. And so a lot of the hangups that a lot of developers have around doing C programming, a lot of the things have been solved with C++. So for instance, one of the things you typically have to do when you're doing C programming is you have to work with pointers. Well, in C++, they've added this concept of smart pointers, which makes it a lot easier to do your memory management. So, and it also makes your C++ code safer. So that's something to take a look at if you're interested in learning more about C++. Number 7, C#. Now this also might seem like a little bit of a red herring, but C# is actually still widely used. It's been around for about 20 years now. And it takes a lot of its inspiration from the Java programming language, but there's been a lot more growth in C# than there has been in Java. So one of the things that's nice about C# is that it is a garbage collected language. So a lot of the difficulties you might have with doing memory management in a language like C, that's been solved in C#. Plus, it also has a lot of functional characteristics as well. About 10 years ago, they added LINQ into the language, which makes it a lot easier to do functional type of expressions inside of the language. And so it's also heavily used in the enterprise. So Jacksonville, where I'm based, it's a very popular language. And so it's normally associated with, I think, since it's associated with Microsoft and stuff like that, people think of it as being this kind of stodgy enterprise type of language. But there's actually a lot of interesting development that's going on right now with C#. So if you take a company like GitHub, for example, they actually do a lot of internal development using C# as an example. They're coincidentally also owned by Microsoft, so that may play a part into that. But C# has expanded and .NET has expanded so that it runs not just on the Windows platform, but it also runs on Mac OS and Linux. And because of that, there's all kinds of tooling and stuff like that's become very popular with it as well. So for instance, if you're interested in doing game development, there's a framework called Monogame, which is based off of C# and .NET. So it may be something you may be interested in. And it's been open sourced. It's open source language, just like most of the others I'm mentioning here in this video. Number 6, Java. So Java still to this day is a very important language. It was introduced around 1995 or so. And I think a lot of people kind of associate it as being kind of another kind of a older, stodgier type of language. But it's actually quite nice, and it's also being used quite a bit still in the enterprise environment. It's also used by a lot of cloud and Silicon Valley-based companies. So if you take a company like Twitter, for example, a lot of their services and stuff are actually written in Java or in another JVM-style language. So it does have features similar to C++ and C#. It's object-oriented language. It also has garbage collection built into the language. But there's still a lot of applications, a lot of code out there written in Java. So it may be one you might want to consider learning if you've not learned it already. Number 5, Python. So Python's another language. It's been around for a while. It's a scripting language. It's also interpreted. And but the thing that's really interesting about Python is that it's also used as a learning language. And on top of being used as a learning language, it's also used a lot nowadays for machine learning and AI type of applications. And so there's a number of libraries, TensorFlow being one of them, that's very popular for doing deep learning or machine learning. And Python's the primary language that's used for that. And so if you have an interest in data science or maybe teaching programming, this is a great language to use for that. It's also a great scripting language, so you can use it for scripting things on the system as well. Number 4, Golang. So Golang is a pretty interesting language. One of the developers on Golang was actually one of the developers for Unix and C, Ken Thompson. And so it has some of its roots in C, but it's meant to be a replacement for C. And so some of the interesting applications that have been used or built with Golang, Docker, Kubernetes, these are all tools and stuff like that. They've all been built with Golang. And one of the things that's interesting about Go is that there's no libraries that you import. Everything is compiled from source. And so typically when you're writing a Go application, you have a folder structure that you use as the basis, and anything that you're going to include, you actually include the source code for that in your project. So one of the things that's I think is pretty interesting about Go is that they also have a lot of modern features. So memory management is really, you don't have to worry about that so much. It's really kind of handled by a garbage collector. And you can compile it onto multiple different platforms and operating systems. So it supports the ARM architecture. It also supports Intel x86 architectures. And it'll work on Mac OS, Linux, and Windows. So it's a good general purpose language to learn. Number 3, JavaScript, good old JavaScript. And so I think JavaScript is a good one to learn if you're planning on doing any type of web development. The built-in language to every browser is JavaScript. JavaScript has an interesting history. It started out at Mozilla, and it was meant to be kind of like this scripting kind of like add-on. I think Java was intended to be the primary language that they're hoping people would build applications with. But JavaScript has just grown in popularity, and it exploded in popularity. I want to say probably around 2009 when Node.js was initially released. And so one of the things that's interesting about JavaScript now is that it doesn't just run in the browser. It can run pretty much anywhere. It can run on some types of devices. Like, for instance, this is a Pixel.js. This is a microcontroller board with an LCD display that has a JavaScript interpreter built into it. You can also run it on the server now. You can use it for doing system programming. So a lot of things that people never thought that you could use JavaScript for, JavaScript is being written for these types of applications. So if you've not learned JavaScript, it's definitely a good one to take up in 2022. Number 2, Swift. Now, I have to admit that I have a little bit of a bias here because my day job, I primarily do programming for iOS, and Swift has become the default development language in the whole Apple ecosystem. But it's expanded outside of the Apple ecosystem. So you can actually do Swift development on Linux and on Windows now as well. You can do server development using Swift. And Swift has a lot of neat modern features like type inference and that sort of thing. But just recently, just in the last year, they've added a new set of language features for doing asynchronous programming. So they've added async and await into the language, but they also have this concept of actors also built into the language. And so if you're looking at doing anything with concurrency or asynchronous programming, stuff like that, they've just made it a whole lot easier. Swift is also unique in that it does not use garbage collections like Java or C# does. But what they've actually done is they've built the memory management into the compiler. And so it's a pretty slick language because of that. But it's also very fast because it's a type-based compiled type of language. So if that's one of your, if you're interested in doing mobile development, especially in the Apple ecosystem, I'd say that's a must learn. And that brings us to number 1, bring in the drum roll, Rust. So Rust is kind of an interesting one. Rust was also developed by the Mozilla organization, just like JavaScript was. But the thing that's interesting about Rust is that it is meant to be a general purpose, type-based language, very similar to Go, but it has a lot of safety features built into it. So one of the concepts that's pretty important around Rust is this idea of ownership. And this is something that other languages are looking to adopt as well. The idea of ownership is that when you initialize a value inside of Rust, whatever you've initialized that to owns that value. You can be referenced as a read-only reference by other variables inside of Rust, but unless you mutate it, it's not something that, or you change ownership, I should say, it's not something that you wouldn't be able to write to from a different variable. And so they also have a lot of concurrency features built into it to prevent race conditions and things like that. It's meant to be a replacement for C, similar to Go. But the difference here is that you can actually do system-level programming with Rust. And just to show some examples of things that have been written in Rust, there's a new JavaScript runtime similar to Node.js called Deno. That's all written in Rust. And for the first time, they're starting to allow code into the Linux kernel that's also written in Rust. And so if you're looking to do lower level or very high performance type of computing, Rust is definitely a language you might be interested in using. And as a matter of fact, it is the language that I'm planning on learning in 2022. So with that being said, please give my video a thumbs up if you liked it. If you didn't like it, you can give it a thumbs down, but give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe to my channel. Have a nice day.